Good morning, everyone. We'll get started here in just a minute. So please bear with us while we wait for everyone else to join. Thank you. Karina, do we want to go ahead and get started? How many folks do we have on, or should we wait a few more minutes?
We'll give a couple more minutes.
Okay, just let me know when.
Okay. Okay, I think we can go ahead and start.
Okay, sounds good. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is CC Bennett with Prevention Government Solutions. And thank you for joining our CMMC Proposed Rule Explored webinar that we are doing in conjunction with Security Bricks and Raj and his team. So this morning we're going to talk a little bit about CMMC, just some of the myths and some of the things that people have questions on. This is a very open discussion, so please feel free to leave any questions that you have in the Q&A chat window, and we will try to address those at the end of the webinar. And we will go ahead and hop right in and get started. We have some good information for you, and we hope that it's beneficial for you for your CMMC planning efforts, whether you are an organization seeking certification, whether you're doing self-certification, or whether you're an MSP or an MSSP that's interested in CMMC as one of your revenue streams. So we'll go ahead and hop right in. So just a little bit about Prevention Government Solutions. We are a Nashville-based firm. We specialize in cyber risk assurance, and our primary focus is the government space. So we work with different government agencies and around regulatory compliance and cybersecurity. We do a lot of work around the NIST FISMA, which obviously naturally leads us into working in the CMMC space. And we also work a lot around zero trust and zero trust architectures. So that's just a little bit of just a quick blurb about us as a company. We are a C3PAO. We have certified CMMC professionals on staff, including assessors and CMMC professionals. So we look forward to hopefully working with you in the future, or at least hearing from you, so that we can assist you with any CMMC needs that you may have. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Raj and let him do a little bit of an intro for Security Bricks.
Thanks, CC. Good morning, everyone. My name is Raj Raghavan. I'm with Security Bricks. Again, thanks for joining this. We kind of, as you see, we we decided to do this together to make this webinar more of a Q&A informative session. I'm sure there's many companies that are offering similar webinars and information, which is great for the industry, because there's still a lot of confusion and there's still a lot of ambiguity out there. We took this, as you go through the webinar, you'll see that we took a different approach about really addressing various parts of the ecosystem, from the contractors to the people who serve the contractors so they can work with the DoD. We talk a little bit about supply chain. So we want this to be more interactive. So please ask questions, just like we would do on an intro call with you, so that any information we have, we can get to you. If we don't have it, we will find it for you. What we know, again, some of these are proposed rules, so things can change. We are a company based here in the US. We are US citizens. We work in 4 time zones, and many of our colleagues are veterans. We also have people with TS clearance. Focus is simple. We are hyper-focused on cloud security and compliance. We have a unique position where we are a CMMC third-party assessor, just like CC. It's very unique that 2 people when competing with each other are putting a webinar, but we also collaborate a lot. So that shows how much there's a need for this market to work together. We are also a FedRAMP 3 third-party assessor. So we are one of the handful companies that have the ability to do both FedRAMP and CMMC. Big partner of ServiceNow. We'll talk about how we use their automation, and we do work with Microsoft. One of the big things we have been proud of is to partner with DoD on their Skill Bridge program. We are one of their partners, and we do have currently interns working with us. We have a number of people we transition from the service industry, from the service into the industry, with a focus on cyber. So again, thank you all. We're excited that you're here, and we hopefully can add some color and clarify some of your questions. Thank you, CC.
All right, thank you, Raj. Okay, so let's talk about some of the basics around CMMC and CUI and FCI. And a lot of times this is just taken for granted. We assume that people understand, what the difference is between a level 1 and a level 2 assessment. So we're not going to make that assumption. We're going to talk a little bit about it. We're going to make some comparisons, hopefully answer some of your questions, and then we'll take it from there. So when we're looking at a level 1 assessment, well, let me just say this first. So that there's 2 levels of assessments, level 1 and level 2. And actually there's a level 3, but we're not going to talk about that one today. We're going to talk about level 1s and level 2s. And then there's 3 different types of assessments, right? Or actually 2 different types of assessments. There's CMMC self-assessments, and then there's CMMC certification assessments. And we're going to talk about the differences between those as well, because that's important when you're scoping out your environment and you're trying to determine which path you should follow. So for level 1 assessment, basically we're looking at 17 practices, and these are practices that are focused on FCI, or federal contract information, and not CUI. So if you have CUI in your environment, then you don't even want to be looking at a level 1. You're probably going to be looking at a level 2. Okay, so that may shortcut that for some of you guys. The level 1 assessments require annual reporting of the assessment score, which you've probably heard of. That reporting is done through the Supplier Performance Risk System, which is also called SPRS. And you also have to annually affirm that you are in compliance with the CMMC regulations for whatever level that you are affirming. So there's no plan of action or milestones allowed for level 1. So you have to meet all the controls in order to be level 1 compliant. And then obviously, since we're only looking at 17 controls, this is going to be the least expensive assessment that you're looking at, even a self-assessment. And a lot of people say, well, if it's a self-assessment, it's not going to cost me any money. Well, it actually will cost you money. It'll cost you money in time and resources internally to your environment. So you still have to keep that in mind, even if you're looking at a self-assessment. And that becomes even more true when you're looking at the level 2 assessments. Just a couple of things that we wanted to mention as a data point. One of the things I'm going to try to do during at least my part of the presentation is to try to define all of the acronyms, because a lot of times you come to these calls and it's acronym soup and you just have all these acronyms and everybody's just throwing them out and people assume you understand. So we're going to try to define the acronyms as we go through so that you know exactly what we're talking about in plain English. One of the things that we found out pretty recently is that the DoD plans to release the final rule towards the end of this year, 2024. So once that is out, then the clock starts ticking as far as implementation and implementation deadline. So we wanted to make sure that you were aware of that, at least what we've heard. You know, that's not written in stone, obviously, that can change, but from what we understand currently right now, that's a deadline that you can work toward. So if you're one of the folks that's been sitting on the fence and saying, yeah, I'm just gonna kind of wait and see what happens. I'm gonna, you know, I don't want to do anything right now. You may want to go back and reevaluate that stance because we do see an end of the light at the tunnel. So that's something good. Now, when we start looking at level 2 assessments, they're a little different. Level 2 self-assessments. So for a self-assessment, it's still looking at controls, but now we're looking at 110 practices or controls that we're going to be looking at. The self-assessment is going to look at assets that store, process, or transmit CUI. Now, obviously, CUI stands for Control Unclassified Information. And this is going to be a little different from FCI. FCI, of course, is only looking at those 17 controls. Now you're looking at 110 controls, and you're looking at controls, different types of assets inside of the environment, right? So you'll have CUI assets, you'll have contract or risk managed assets, which are documented, have to be documented in your documentation, things like your system security plan, but don't actually, but are not fully assessed. They may be subjected to a limited assessment, but not fully assessed, or specialized assets, which are documented and not assessed at all. So when you start looking at level 2 assessments, even the self-assessments, you have to start breaking your assets down into certain groups, and then that dictates how that asset is assessed or treated during your assessment. Now, level 2 assessments require triannual reporting. So you report every 3 years, a minimum of every 3 years. But again, you are required to do annual affirmation of compliance. Okay. Now, this is something a little different. Level 2 assessments will allow you to have a POAM for selected requirements. So that's not every requirement. There are certain requirements that you cannot have a POAM on, but there are some that you can have a POAM on. And for those that you can have a POAM, you are allowed to have that POAM up to 180 days. After 180 days, that POAM has to be closed out in order for you to proceed further. Okay. And then, of course, if we're looking at 110 controls, it's going to have more of an impact financially, resource-wise, than it would if you're just looking at 17 controls. So that's something to keep in mind as well. All right, so let's just do a quick summary. Level 1 versus level 2 self-assessment. Now, these are both self-assessments. These are not certification assessments. We'll talk about that in a bit. But when you're looking at level 1 versus level 2, you can see that the reporting requirement is a little different for level 2, as we mentioned, 3-year reporting requirement. But both of them have that annual reporting affirmation in SPRS. Okay, POAMs are allowed in level 2, but not allowed in level 1. Documentation requirements are a little different between the two. For level 1, there is no official requirement to have full documentation for those 17 controls. But let's be honest, if you're implementing those controls, you probably should have some documentation for it. It may not require a full POAM or I'm sorry, a full SSP or really extensive documentation. But even for level 1, you should have some documentation. Level 2 documentation is a little bit more of a requirement because many of the controls or practices in level 2 do require some form of documentation. So you're going to have a heavier lift for documentation for level 1 versus level 2 self-assessments. Level 1's self-assessments are looking at the basic safeguards, and level 2 are looking at more of the advanced practices that you get when you start looking at those 110. There's no certification assessment needed for either one of the self-assessments. So you can feel free to do the self-assessment yourself, or many organizations will bring in a third party to assist them with it because they just don't have the resources or the knowledge in-house to be able to do that. And again, when we talked about costs, we obviously, level ones are going to be the least expensive because of the scope versus a level two that's going to be a little bit more expensive. It's going to be definitely more expensive than a level one, and probably less expensive than a level three once we get more detail on that. Okay. So one more thing I wanted to talk about before we hand it over to Raj to talk about certification requirements for MSPs is the concept of readiness versus CMMC assessment. So you probably heard a lot of C3PAOs talk about doing readiness assessments and how those assessments can help your environment. And that is absolutely true. A readiness assessment can be very beneficial. But as the slide mentions, it's sometimes splitting hairs between what a C3PAO can do versus what an organization like an RPO or registered practitioner can do. So let me kind of talk about that and break that down a little bit. So as a C3PO, we can do things like we can do what's called a met not met assessment, right? A met not met assessment is an assessment that goes in, looks at your environment, and determines whether you meet or you don't meet those requirements. And if we do that type of assessment, we can follow up that assessment with a certification assessment, okay? But that met not met assessment, as mentioned there in the bullets, it cannot provide any type of guidance, right? Or it can't provide any type of consulting, I should say. It can't provide consulting around your policies, your documentation, how to implement controls, how to manage your environment. That met not met assessment is just that. It's just looking at those controls, determining if they're met or not met, and letting you know that. And if it's not met, then of course you have the option of going out and doing the remediation either on your own or using a third party to assist you in that. But that met not met assessment and that CMMC certification assessment are really can be part of the same package. But obviously that C3PO has to remain completely independent when they're doing those assessments. So they can't offer you any type of consulting or assistance, but they can provide that met not met assessment. Now, on the other side of the fence, there are different types of readiness assessments. Now, readiness assessment can be anything from an organization coming in and helping you write your policies and procedures and then just doing an assessment against it, or an independent assessment against it, determining whether everything is in place. They could be helping you implement new technologies. They could be helping you close gaps. They could be actually part of your management environment and helping you do that. If they do all of those kind of things, that also can be considered readiness, but it's just readiness on the consulting side. So I know that's a little bit confusing, or it can be confusing, but hopefully that clears it up a little bit. So we just wanted to make sure that we kind of brought a little bit of clarity to that. So a lot of organizations they're going out there, they're trying to determine, am I ready? And if I am ready, how do I know that I'm ready? If you're an organization and you're trying to determine that, you can determine that on the consulting side with whoever you want to consult with, an external third party, or even an independent consulting engagement internally to your organization. Or you can go the C3PAO route, which they can do a met not met assessment, which does not include any consulting, and then they can follow that up with the certification assessment if that's a requirement for your organization. Okay. All right, I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to pause, and I'm going to ask if there are any questions.
Yeah, we have a question. What should companies do between now and the final rule?
Well, between now and the final rule, companies should be preparing for CMMC. And there's really a couple of things that I typically suggest. If the number one thing you want to do is you want to evaluate your ability to self-assess. If you can self-assess, then you want to start evaluating your environment and how compliant are you right then, at that point in time. If you can't self-assess and you need to bring in a third party, then now is the time to start looking for that organization, to start having those conversations so that you can arrange for that assistance to come in. And really, my suggestion is really a 6-month timeline. So think of it this way. For the first month, for the first to the second month, perform a gap analysis of your environment. Then for the third through the fourth month, begin that remediation of your environment and try to close all the gaps that you identified through that gap analysis. Then that would be a good time to perform that final internal walkthrough of each of the practices and compare the results to what you have documented in your system security plan. And if you don't have a system security plan and you're a level 2, then this would be a good time to start developing a system security plan, because that's going to be your Bible, as they say, as to what CMMC means to your environment and how it's implemented. Now, months 5 through 6, you want to start working with the C3PO to perform a met assessment for confirmation of where you stand as far as the controls. And again, that met assessment is going to be just an independent evaluation of how close you are to being compliant, right? It's not going to be full and in-depth. It's going to be just an evaluation of how close you are to being compliant. And then by that 6th month, you want to begin conversations with the C3PO to begin estimating your cost. Now, that may apply to some folks. That will only apply to the folks that have a requirement for certification. If you have a requirement for self-certification, then you don't have to start having those conversations. But I always encourage organizations that think that they may have even an idea that they may be eligible or may be required to do a self-cert or certification assessment, to go ahead and start those conversations, because it's better to have those conversations already in your back pocket along with an estimated cost than it is to wait until you do get a contract that does require the certification assessment and then not have any type of arrangement in place to proceed forward. That's going to put you at a competitive disadvantage. You're welcome. All right, any other questions? No, that's all we got. Okay. All right, so now I would like to hand it over to Raj, and he is going to talk a little bit about certification requirements for MSPs. Raj?
Yeah, thanks, CC. Again, I want to kind of shift a little bit about, CC talked about what a contractor needs to do in terms of how they are going to be preparing for their CMMC assessment. Before we get here, I think one thing I want to mention, which we do it into every prospect we speak with or every entity we work with, we want to make sure that, first of all, there are many resources out there. There are RPs, there are RPOs, terminologies, and CCPs and C3POs who have to use CCPs. So there's a number of people who have the knowledge, have been trained to help. So there is help available. Obviously, CC mentioned there are approximately about 70,000 plus level 2 contractors. And again, there are only 50, 60 C3POs, and there's more coming, but it is it's still going to take time. The idea is that I think, our suggestion is to educate yourself, right? Wherever you can, that is good news. There are people who are asking for, how much do I have to budget for a C3PO audit if I have to? Numbers are still ambiguous because the rules haven't come out. You could get an estimate, but it depends on the environment. And so the cost of a C3PO is a piece of the puzzle, right? There's other things, and which we'll walk through. The other thing I think it's encouraging, we encourage people to look for, is see what's relevant, right? This is an investment, right? Although it's a cost, it's still an investment, because this is something you have to meet, to be contractually obligated to the DoD and or the prime contractor, DoD contractor you are working with as a sub. And the idea here is that the prime contractor can impose similar rules to your to the subs. So they can tell you if you're a level 1, level 2, because their certification is part of what you provide to them. So it's still a supply chain. It's not everybody who works directly with the DoD. It's the entire supply subchain. So they can also determine, and their auditors can ask for the information. So it's a little more complex. And the second thing is just make sure whatever you plan on, there should be an ROI, right? So to ensure that you have the right tools. There's a number of, and we'll walk through resources that are available, but really it's about starting the journey, and trying to see where you are, where do you need to be, and then where you have to go, right? And yes, there's a lot of people saying you're sitting on the fence, but we still don't know the rules, so we can't jump. But now that we have some clarity, it's at least good to take the first step. So one of the things we wanted to focus in this webinar is talking about the ecosystem of a contractor. Many contractors use, or many entities that work are part of this DIB space, use external service providers. Who are they? They are people who manage your routers, manage your firewalls, manage your servers, right? Managed service providers. Some of them are managed security service providers that possibly manage your, provide a SOC function, a security operations center function. Then there are cloud service providers that are providing various types of, services to you. So although you may have a data center, you may have physical data in your, as part of the, as part of CUI. If these external service providers touch your CUI environment, they are included in your scope. They are part of your boundary. So there's been a lot of conversation about, how to measure their security, right? How to make sure that they are meeting certain requirements. And how is that going to flow down to a contractor who can then submit it as part of the package? So we want to spend a little time talking about MSPs, CSPs, and what they require. So the first thing is MSPs. The guidance that came out, and then there was a DoD memo that followed the proposed rules in December, that clearly says that if you are an external service provider, you have to meet the CMMC level 2 assessment. Next slide, Cece. So you have to undergo a CMMC level 2 assessment, and you have to make sure that you have no POAM. So if you have a POAM, you need to resolve within 180 days. So what does it mean? If you are providing a service to a contractor, you have to have been assessed as a level 2, and then you should be able to then say that, yes, I can, so that when those controls that the contractor, fills in as part of the assessment that come from you, come from the MSP or the external service provider, they can fill those, provided as part of the package up to the auditor and or self-assessment. So the idea here is it's very clear, at least the proposed rules today say that if you are in any, so if you are an IT provider, security provider, anybody who touches that data, so that's, they have to do they have to be part of the CMMC level 2 assessment. Next slide. So then they came up with the cloud service providers. So we hear this all the time as a FedRAMP 3PO. People talk, when we talk about FedRAMP equivalency and FedRAMP assessment, the first thing they say is, hey, we don't do business with any of the 400 plus federal agencies. We do not have a sponsor. So we are not part of the ecosystem. True. But the DoD said, and they've been talking about this for some time, is if you have the ability, or if you have have met those FedRAMP controls for base, moderate base, 320 plus, and you have a third-party assessor, a FedRAMP 3PO, who are listed in the marketplace, assess and sign off on the SSP and the other artifacts, you now can present that and say that's equivalent to being part of a CMMC level 2, meaning that you can present that as an artifact to the DIPCAC so that they can approve you as part of the service provider list. And that's very important. Why? You don't need to have a federal sponsor. You don't need to go to the FedRAMP PMO and submit information because you're not going to be listed in the marketplace. But you will need to have a third-party, FedRAMP third-party assessor come in and assess it. So that's a very critical part. So if you're a cloud service provider or somebody who is part of this CUI ecosystem, you do have the ability to have a FedRAMP equivalency. So in a way, the DoD is kind of embracing FedRAMP to say, yes, we can for certain rules or certain entities. And the idea here is that the confusion of, do I need a sponsor, those go away. But it's very important because if tomorrow, and we always encourage people to look at it as an investment, if tomorrow you do have a federal agency that says, I would like to use your service, I'd like to subscribe, you are almost about 70% there, because at that point, the package that you prepared with the FedRAMP 3PO, you could submit it to the FedRAMP PMO office, and then they can go through their process to get you it through the ATO. So it's a very interesting journey because your investment now, you can use this to market yourself to the federal agency saying, hey, previous time I came to you, it said it'll take me about a year to 2 years to become on the FedRAMP ATO path. Now I'm probably much closer because I already did this for the other DoD ecosystem. So it is something that to consider if you choose, and this is something that's been talked a lot, but again, we can go down, we can break down. Obviously, the FedRAMP is based on 853, CMC is based on 800-171. These are all cyber frameworks. So a lot of people ask us, hey, which one should I go? Why should I go? Well, it just depends on your business, how you want to do it, where you think you have a ability to meet it, and then you can go down that path. Next slide, Cici. Okay, so how do we achieve? As we talked earlier, there's no federal sponsor. You don't have to be listed in the marketplace, but there are 320 plus controls, and these are published. It's based on, right now it's based on 853 Rev 5 that they came out in last May. You do need a SSP. There's a lot of conversations about an SSP, a POAM, and a security assessment reports. And these are defined in your proposed rules that you need to present these as that have been reviewed and approved by a third-party assessor, a FedRAMP 3PO. You need to present it as part of the package. So this is something that has come out as guidance. And again, we have seen a lot of people ask us questions about, which path should I go? How should I go? And there's a lot of conversations too. FedRAMP, again, like CMMC, it's a little more mature because there are about 320 services that are listed in the marketplace. So there are 300 plus. So there are defined costs, defined processes. We have seen in our part of our readiness and other things, we know what it takes. We know an estimate. So it's a little more, ahead of the CMMC curve in terms of planning and cost. But it's something, if you have more questions, you should really encourage someone to help you out, at least plan the journey before you start saying which one you want to go to. Next slide. Okay, so I just want to throw a blurb here. We had a press release today too. So as part of our partnership with ServiceNow, Security Breaks has released 2 free accelerators, actually 3, 1 for FedRAMP and 2 for CMMC. If you're a ServiceNow or any of the customers are a ServiceNow customer, they can actually go down to the store and they can download it for free. It has all the content. So one of the things and we wanted to do is ensure that we can provide, there are some automation that's available because this doesn't have to be a people-only process and there's only so many people who can help. So some of these can be automated, just like any GRC tool does. But there's another tool called Algorithms that has similar, and that can cater to small to medium-sized businesses. That's out there too. And so there are a few tools that are available that have content in them, meaning that it comes with all the controls. You can perform assessments, you can automate, there are integrations. It certainly helps you save a lot of time and money and also your customers. So we also want to make sure that part of this journey, how much can you automate? Because these assessments are not a point in time. CC mentioned that every 3 years, and if you're a provider, it's every year. The idea here is that this is something you want to be able to put as a process because it's not one and done. And sometimes if you keep restarting these and keep redoing these, it's going to take a lot more money and effort. So the idea here is if you can automate certain pieces of it, if you can get some more, you can reduce the dependency on people, it probably helps save a lot of time and money. Next slide. So I'll give it back to CC here at this point and have him go through the checklist. And kind of walk you through, and then obviously we have more questions that if we are asked, so we want to go through a FAQ, and then we'll see if you have any questions that we can answer. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Raj. So just a CMMC checklist. So first question, are you a level 1 or level 2 contractor? Yeah, that's an important question because your level of CMMC requirement is going to dictate your level of effort. It's also going to dictate how long it's going to take you to achieve certification. And then one thing that we didn't put on here that you probably should also consider is if you're level 2, are you level 2 self-assessment or level 2 certification assessment. So that's a difference between the two, which is also going to impact definitely your cost factor, but also your level of effort. Second one, do you need a C3PO assessment as a level 2 contractor? Again, it's kind of going back to my first point. Yeah, that's going to make a big difference. Now, the thing to keep in mind about whether you need a level 2, whether you need a C3PO to conduct a level 2 certification assessment is that certification requirement is part of your contract, right? So it's dictated by the Department of Defense, and it should be documented in your contract. It's not something that's not a decision that you can make internally yourself, or C3PO can make for you. It's definitely something that's going to be dictated in your contract. If your contract says that you have a self-assessment requirement, then that's what you need to work towards. If it says that you have a C3PO, a DoD assisted assessment requirement, then a certification assessment is what you're going to need to shoot for. So just keep that in mind, that your contract will drive what level of certification that you'll have to go through, or what process you'll have to go through. Are you currently compliant to DFAR 7012? That's an interesting one to keep on your checklist, because if you are currently compliant, then it's a fairly easy lift from the DFAR 7012 over to the CMMC requirements. For level 1, those 17 controls are directly pulled over from the existing FAR requirements. So there's really nothing new in those 17 controls. So if you are already meeting those 17 controls, then it's going to be a pretty easy transition to CMMC 2.0 for level 1. And level 2 is very similar. If you were already meeting the DFAR 7012 by using the NIST 800-171 Rev 2 controls, then it's going to almost be a straight shift over to CMMC 2.0. So for those folks that are currently reporting as compliant and that really are compliant, it's really going to benefit you. It's kind of a bonus that you're really not having to do anything that's going to be new, but the certification may be a little new as far as working with the C3PO, because before it was just a self-reporting kind of honor system based self-certification. Now you'll have to prove it if you have to do the certification path, but it's going to be a pretty easy path to get there. Let's see, the fourth question or checklist item is, are you using an MSP or MSSP or a GCC high enclave? Yeah, that's a very interesting one, and kind of going back to what Raj was mentioning just before. If you are using a GCC high enclave, or maybe a Gov Cloud enclave, then you are able to inherit some of those control or practices, how they're implemented, into your own environment if you're using that. If you're using an MSP or MSSP that's not in that environment, then you will want to check with them and find out, are they planning on meeting those requirements? Are they waiting to see what the final requirements are? You want to get a good understanding of kind of where they are, because if they're not going to be able to meet the CMMC requirements, whatever the final requirements may wind up being, then you may want to add a step into your planning process to really start investigating some other options or fallback options if that MSSP can't continue to work with you and still meet the CMMC requirements. Do you subcontract to a prime contractor? Yeah, that's a good question too, because if you are a contractor and if you're a subcontractor and you're reporting to a prime, does that prime require you to be self-certified, or does that prime require you to be to go through the full CMMC certification with a certification through a C3PAO and the DoD? So that's going to be dictated again in your contract. That's going to be should be a contract line item from your prime, and your prime will dictate what level of certification they need you to be in order for them to be compliant with their contract with the DoD. And then the final one is, do you need to be compliant with any other regulations or regulatory framework? And that's something that you have to ask yourself, because even though the CMMC 2.0 is very specific as to what you need to, the requirements that you need to meet, primarily the 800-171 Rev 2. You also, obviously, if you're an organization that's in a certain vertical, you may also have other regulations and regulatory framework requirements that you have to meet. So you don't have to be compliant with those for CMMC, but obviously for your business, you still may have to be compliant, and that may bleed over to your CMMC environment. But as long as you're meeting the minimum requirements for CMMC, then that's what your assessor or your auditor is going to look for as far as CMMC compliance is concerned. Okay. Now, I will take a quick break here. Do we have any additional questions that we need to address? Karina, did you have anything that came in through the chat that we need to address?
Yes, I have a couple of questions. So the first one is, will there be a level 2 self-assessment be allowed under NIST 800-171 revision 3? The update proposes only independent assessments, no self-assessments.
Yeah, the update, as you said, proposes just independent assessments. I don't know. I don't want to look into my crystal ball, because 9 times out of 10, I'm usually wrong when I'm trying to guess these things. But the history has shown that there has been a history of self-assessments, and primarily a lot of that is driven just by not only the need for them based on requests from organizations seeking certification, but also just the limited number of C3POs, organizations that can go out and do the assessment. So I'm going to say I hope that there will be, but currently right now it's looking like it won't. But don't take that as written in stone, because that definitely can change based on the landscape of CMMC and the requirements.
All right, I have another question. What are the minimal documentation requirements for level 1? And what are the actual documentation requirements for submission to SPRS at level 1?
So the minimum requirement for level 1 is for the organization seeking certification, or the OSC, to submit that affirmation for level 1. That's basically it. You're not required to submit any additional documentation. Like, you don't need to submit an SSP or any other program documentation. You just have to do the affirmation and submit your. Obviously, you don't really submit a score because you're required to be in compliance with all 17 of the controls for level 1. So that affirmation is really the only thing that you have to submit. Now, I say that, and let me also say this. If you don't have any documentation for your level 1 certification, self-assessment, then you're probably not doing those controls correctly. Now, there's nothing written, at least not that I know of, that says that the DoD will go back and check level 1s to ensure that you have documentation in place, or that you're actually meeting those 17 controls. But to be frank, you really have to have at least some documentation to say that you're meeting some of those, the minimum baseline for some of those controls. So you don't have to submit it, but it's best if you do have something that you can use to back it up.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, we can go ahead and I'll ask you those other questions at the end.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. Heather, do you have any questions that came in before the webinar? Oh, okay. Yeah. She has one that says, what's the difference between a level 2 self-assessment and a level 2 certification assessment? And that's a good question. So a level 2 certification assessment is a requirement, as we mentioned, of your contract, and that's required by the DoD, or that's required by your prime if you're a sub, and it's not defined by anyone else. And a level 2 certification assessment is a scored assessment, and it's reported to the DoD through EMAS. So it's a little different than reporting it through SPRS. So when a C3PO or a certified third-party assessment organization comes in and they do this assessment, then they're going to report your score and how you did on that assessment through a system called EMAS, which is the Enterprise Mission Assurance Support Services system. And then EMAS will take those scores and eventually put those scores into SPRS for the Department of Defense. Another thing to keep in mind about a certification assessment is that it's a triannual assessment as well. So when you get certified, you are good for 3 years. But again, you also have to go in on an annual basis and affirm your compliance. So you don't have to get recertified again for another 3 years. But you do have to affirm on an annual basis your compliance, just like you would do on a level 2 self-assessment. There are POAMs that are allowed again for a level 2 certification assessment. They're selected POAMs. It's the same set of selected POAMs that you can implement as a self-certified level 2. But again, you have to have those closed out within 180 days. The reason that 180-day limit is important is because if you go through the certification assessment and say you get through the entire assessment and you have 1 or 2 items that are listed on a POAM, then as long as those items aren't critical items, then you can be listed as a conditional certification assessment, right? So you can be listed as conditional. Now, once you close out those items on that POAM, then you move to the final certification, the final certification assessment. So you can be conditional and then you can move to final. But there are conditions to being conditional, and then there are requirements to being final. And the final means that you have no POAMs, everything is closed out, you met all the requirements, and then you can move into that final POAM stage. So it's also good to note too that if you have a contract, for example, that requires that certification assessment, you are required to either be in the conditional certification assessment stage or the final certification stage to qualify for that contract. Okay, so that's important to note because that's where the timing can be important as to whether you got started early and you're already in a conditional state, or you got started late and you push yourself back. Okay. All right. Anything else, Heather?
We
Good.
can hold the rest of the.
Okay. All right. So I think that answers all of those questions. I'm going to move to our final slide. So we wanted to offer anyone who attended the webinar a readiness assessment. It's a 1-hour session. So let me just be clear. We're not going to assess your whole environment in an hour. So so if you were thinking that's not going to happen. But we are offering a free session to sit down and to help you to get a better understanding of where you are as far as your CMMC journey is concerned. To give you some pointers, to give you some advice, to give you some information. This is a free, we call it a readiness assessment. So we can, if you tell us about what you're doing in your environment, we can give you a good idea of how ready you are, whether it's a self-assessment or whether it's a certification assessment in the future, and just give you some good advice. We wanted to make sure that this webinar was not just us regurgitating information, but also the opportunity for us to further our conversation and to really give you some practical advice one-on-one. A lot of people may not be comfortable talking about it on a webinar, but the one-on-one sessions will we definitely can talk about that. We can also exchange NDAs if that works and help you from there. So before we go into any final questions, Raj, Karina, did you guys have anything else that you may want to mention?
Thanks, CC, and appreciate all your time. We have a few minutes for questions, which we're excited to go through, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about free resources I talked earlier about. So I think before you or your customer or whoever in your ecosystem wants to take this journey or start to look into it, we suggest that we're open to having a conversation to help you. Whoever you choose to, it's fine, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of people who can help, but we just want to make sure we can provide what we know to put you on the right path. A lot of free resources. I tell people all the time that you don't have to pay for everything. There's a lot of support that's coming from the community, including something from ourselves. We put out free tools out there too, so that we can help, along with everybody else to get started on this journey. There is a cost, absolutely. A lot of people are asking, how much it's going to, because some of these are unplanned. So, but there are things that are available you can take advantage of. So here are some free resources. As we get more, we'll update them. We have a number of people who are helping, providing support. So I would highly encourage you to take advantage. And as CC mentioned, if you'd like, some more one-on-one conversations, just to clarify anything or have a scoping discussion, or just to say, hey, if I'm going to go down this journey, what's going to take? We're happy to have a conversation. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Rod.
We just have some questions and we can close.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, so first question I have is, we are a Canadian organization catering both Canadian and US DIBs. Should we be going for CMMC assessments or wait till CSD Canadian CMMC equivalent is finalized?
That's a good question. I know that the CMMC leadership with Matt Travis, I know that they're discussing how they want to handle Canadian firms, but I don't think that they've come up with an answer yet. So I don't know what the answer would be. I know, and I don't know, actually, I don't know whether we have the full ability to assess Canadian firms and whether that assessment, whether the assessment status will be honored in Canada. I'm sure it will, but we just don't have an answer yet. Matt updated us a couple of weeks ago and said that they're still in ongoing conversations with Canada and trying to figure out how they want to do it. But I think they're going to have a process that allows U.S. firms to assess Canadian companies and Canadian firms to assess U.S. companies. But for right now, I would say I would wait and see kind of how that shakes out before you make a decision on which way you want to go.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to CC's point, and we see this all the time, even in the FedRAMP world and in other government regulations. People ask us, we got to go. We have an Australian rule out there, Canadian, in some of the Asian countries. So I think at the end of the day, we talked earlier about is how can we make sure that, because all these are cyber controls, it doesn't matter if it's 53 ones, they are, although they're different rules, it's still about cyber hygiene. It's about protecting the data. You can have an MFA, you can have log analysis. So if you're able to have that documented, anyone can help you and say, yep, do you meet, maybe you have a delta there. So the way we approach this is take a holistic approach about what are the base security controls you want to implement, the hygiene stuff, the things that you have to protect, and then you can kind of go see what each flavor looks like. So I think, we always encourage people that as cybersecurity professionals, protection, data protection, ensuring, because these are, the regulations are nothing but checking what you've implemented. So the idea is if you've implemented these and somebody wants, you want it in this artifact, I want maybe a different type of FIPS encryption, whatever it may be, you can actually go from there. But the base should still be like protecting the data and ensuring you're able to have some cyber hygiene there. So we highly encourage you to take that approach because it saves time, money, and resources to manage them. So, and thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Raj.
I have a second question. Is there a mandate for GCC high environment for a CMMC level 2 certification?
No. That's the short answer.
Yeah. So you can have any environment that you would like to have for CMMC. You can have your own data centers. We have a number of people we speak with have their own data centers and they plan to keep it there. Totally fine. If you, as CC mentioned, you do want to go to the Gov Cloud or any of those other types, absolutely, you can save a lot of time, but it comes at a cost. But you do save a lot of time and resource because you have the ability to inherit a lot of controls, which is very good in terms of your responsibility matrix now. So if you take a responsibility matrix, you have the controls you're responsible, you have the ones you share, and the ones you inherited. So those will start to change the equation. And yes, there will be less things you really are responsible. But at the end of the day, it just depends on how much your service, your software can fit, or your system can fit into those clouds. That's very important because those clouds are rigid. They have the controls and you're kind of retrofitting yours. If that works and everything else works, we highly encourage you because you're work reduces. If you don't, and if you still feel a business case to have it on a data center or another hosted place, absolutely, you can put the controls on them, and you can do it either way.
Yeah. The thing to keep in mind too is that earlier in the CMMC history, everyone was talking about GCC high, and GCC high was a requirement, and a lot of organizations went into GCC high, or they went to the GovCloud high, but it was later clarified that the moderate environment is really, if you want to pick one of those, moderate environment is where you have to be. You don't have to be in a high environment for CUI. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you're looking at moving over to, GovCloud or moving over to GCC, you don't have to be in a GCC high environment to meet the CMMC requirement. You can be in a moderate environment and still meet it, whether you're doing it independently or whether you're using a third party to do that. So.
All right, another question. What should be the right approach to prepare SSPs? Does every defense contract need to have a separate SSP?
So the correct approach to developing an SSP is to develop the SSP after you implement your controls inside of your environment, your practices inside of your environment. It's not a good idea to write an SSP and then implement the controls, and then go back and try to update the SSP later on, because that's just going to create double work. So what we always encourage organizations to do, and the way that we do it for organizations, is that we tell them, implement, you know which controls you want to implement those controls, and then go back and document how those controls are implemented. And the key to a successful SSP is to make sure that you are fully detailing out in the section called implementation detail. Make sure you're fully detailing out what you've done, how it satisfies the control, and how it's documented, or whether, you may be pointing out to other documentation or referring out to other places for documentation. But you want to be very detailed, as much as detailed as you can be in that section without being overly verbose. But you want to make sure that is really telling the story. What we always tell organizations is that if you hand an auditor or an assessor your SSP, they should be able to read that document and fully understand how CMMC is handled inside of your environment, how it's processed, how it's transmitted, and where it's stored for all the components that are part of your CMMC scope. So that needs to be almost like a storytelling document that has all of the juicy details in it, so that someone can pick it up and know how to evaluate your environment. Does that answer your question? Hopefully.
Right, I hope so. Can you clarify CSP and ESP and their requirements?
Sure, absolutely. I'm going to talk this one, and I know Raj probably has a little bit to say about this one as well. So cloud security providers are CSP, is what that acronym stands for. It's a little different from what CMMC and the DoD considers to be ESPs, which are external service providers. So external service providers would be everything except a cloud service provider. Cloud service provider they have slightly different requirements as far as what has to be done. They don't have the equivalency requirement as it's defined in DFARS for it used to be for MSPs, but now they include ESPs, external service providers, are the big umbrella. That's kind of the main difference. But cloud service provider is going to be your Amazon, it's going to be your Google, or it's going to be your Microsoft providing those cloud services, and then certain requirements that they have to meet. ESPs, or external service providers, are going to be the folks that may do, they may manage your firewalls, they may manage your workstations, and they're doing all of those either from the cloud or from some internal network that they have that they manage from themselves. Raj, did you have anything to add to that?
No, you did perfect. So I think also it's CSPs, anybody who delivers a service in the cloud, right? Which means that I think to a point is it's software or hardware, a space like a Google Enclave, a Microsoft Enclave or a Google Cloud. All those are considered to be CSPs, and some of the definitions also related to what FedRAMP considers to be. It could be Adobe's and the DocuSigns and the other people who are providing those services that you're consuming through a website address, you're able to go there, but if they store CUI, they are obligated to meet those requirements. But the other ones are people, like he mentioned, so people who are just help desk, right? But they're able to touch CUI. They're backing your data up. They're looking at your logs. They're part of your forensics team, or they're just part of your desktop cleansing team, right? So those people they're not providing a cloud service on a URL, but they're still coming in and touching the CUI data, but they don't work for you. They're not employees of you. They are third parties, companies that you outsource to. And those, so there's ESPs and then there's CSPs. So this to kind of, that's why the ruling was very clear that if you are an ESP, which means you are just doing this service, I'm help desk or running scans and whatnot, please meet level 2 assessments that are from a third party, C3PAO assessor. And your CSPs, you can meet this, or you can have a FedRAMP equivalency because you probably are already invested in it for the federal agencies. So you don't have to do 2 things. So that's kind of how they represent.
Very good.
I think I have the last question. We're running a bit over time, but
Okay.
CMMC defines external service providers as providers who process, store, or transmit CUI or security protection data on assets owned by the ESP. If CUI and security protection data is not stored on the MSP's assets, rather assets owned by the MSP's RMM provider, what is the requirement for the MSP?
Rod, you want that one?
Sorry, I just want to confirm. Yeah. So the service. Okay. So the ESP is defined as somebody who stores, processes, and transmits. Yes. So the question was, if you don't touch it. I mean, I'm sorry, but I'm trying to clarify the question before we can answer that.
Yeah, I'll repeat it. If CUI and security protection data is not stored on the MSP's assets, rather assets owned by the MSP's RMM provider, what is the requirement for the MSP?
What is the RMM provider? That's what I'm trying to get to. So I just want to clarify, whoever asked the question, are you saying that you is a service provider who is not storing, transmitting, or processing the CUI, but it is the data stored in and I just want to clarify where the data is stored. When you say RMM, what is an RMM? Maybe I'm sorry, I want to be cognizant of time. So the person who asked the question, if you don't mind, if you can email us or get in touch, we're happy to clarify. And if we need to, and if I don't have an answer, I'll get you something, because I just want to make sure we're providing the right information, and we need a little more clarification on the question. So appreciate if you can email us or let us know, and we'll get back to you particularly and set up time, or even email you what we know. We can find that out for you.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining the webinar. We sincerely appreciate it. We hope we gave you some good information. We gave you some things to think about. Please feel free to reach out to us. There's both of our websites are up there, and you have our email addresses, our contact us email addresses on the bottom of the slide there. So feel free to reach out. We sincerely appreciate it. We hope everyone has a good day, and thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you all. I appreciate it. Please let us know if we can help you in any way. And thanks for taking the time. Bye-bye.